Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So excited to see many folks here for this event. Welcome to the first of many conversations that will be held by the Middle Passage of Ceremonies and Part Markers projects this February. I hope everyone is excited to be here today for this year's Black History Month speaker series. My name is Michelle Dingle. I will be the moderator for today's event, and this will be closed captioned for your viewer experience. We are honored to have Emory University Professor Emeritus, Dr. David Eltis. It is fitting that Dr. Eltis is the initial presenter in this series because our project has a very special and ongoing relationship with him. Much of the research and scholarship that we use related to ship data and the identification of arrival locations is based on the documentation from voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. This is a database that incorporates 40 years of archival research and brings together images, maps, voyage logs, and other records of approximately 36,000 transatlantic ship crossings and data of some 92,000 Africans forced to make these journeys. Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers project applies the research developed by Dr. Eltis and his team to work with local communities to install markers and hold remembrance ceremonies to honor African ancestors and acknowledge a history and vital narrative of place. Also, full disclosure here, Dr. Eltis is a member of the project's honorary board. So research on the transatlantic maritime history, slavery, and migration has exploded. It is increasingly accessible and is now compiled in several international databases. Dr. Eltis is one of the pioneers in compiling, organizing, and digitally presenting several aspects of the transatlantic human trade in the Voyages database, which, by the way, is housed at Emory University. He, along with Professor Richardson and some other researchers, those including historians and students, have produced groundbreaking material that serves as a resource, not only for scholars, but for many with a desire to better know personal family and local history. So I want to share an example. At a 2018 international conference at the University of Virginia, a young lady said that her family's story passed down through generations indicated that they arrived as captives from Madagascar. She questioned that oral history because West Africa is so frequently associated with the transatlantic trade. We encouraged her to use the Voyages database, and she was able to pinpoint the year and place of departure and arrival of her ancestors, confirming this treasured history. So today's topic, The Roots of Our Roots, expands on this vital history of the early modern Atlantic, based primarily upon documents, journals, and data of port and company records that for many years remained unexplored in numerous countries. So without further ado, please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. David Eltis.
Hello. Many thanks for inviting me to give this talk at the very beginning of Black History Month. I just think that raising the profile and understanding of the slave trade is just more important than ever to understanding US and Black history. But I want to stress also that it's critical to our own project because we depend on public input to provide us with new information on slave voyages. And over the years, and Chin and others have passed on to us data that we've integrated into our databases. And one feature of our site is actually a contribute page. With many sites, contribute means money, but in our case, contribute means data. And we've got an editorial board, and we assess the data, and in many instances, most instances, we actually end up adding information. So the database is actually renewed. And of course, now there are two databases, one for the transatlantic traffic and one for the intra-American traffic from one part of the Americas to the other. That's why the title of the show, so to speak, is in fact the Atlantic slave trades, not trade. So first, a comment on the origins of the project. I guess it goes back to Phil Curtin's 1969 Atlantic slave trade, which attempted to make a more accurate assessment of the size of the traffic and the direction of the traffic. In fact, the first contribution to the database was 2,313 IBM cards, which Curtin sent to me in 1970 after he published his book. So this project over the years collected data from many other people. It was issued first in the form of a CD-ROM in 1999. And subsequently, we had an atlas, which is actually still available, which actually does some things which you can't do on the site itself. It has 187 maps, full color, and because it was subsidized by the Gilder Lehrman Center, it cost $30 instead of the usual case with full atlases, several $100s.
Hey, Dr. Eltis.
Yes.
Can you, we're only seeing the Zoom screen, not the PowerPoint.
Right.
The screen share.
My notice says you are screen sharing.
Yeah, it's only showing your Zoom screen window. Could you stop share and try to share it again? Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry about this. So I'm just clicking share sound is clicked, and I've also.
There it is.
Okay.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
So just continuing, the atlas was 2010, but by that time we'd actually pushed everything to the web, and the first version of which went up in 2008, and we're now looking at the latest version, which dates from 2019. And as I've already mentioned, it's got not only the 36,000 transatlantic voyages, but now 12,000 voyages from one part of the Americas to the other. Plus the fact that shortly, within the next few months, actually by the end of the year, we will have new information on the movement of captives from the Upper South to the Lower South in the 19th century, together with the names of those captives. And that's the result of a new PhD by Jenny Williams from Johns Hopkins University. That's something to look out for, because I think that will greatly increase the usefulness of the site to anyone looking for history of their families. So the database, jumping straight into the transatlantic version of it anyway, looks like this. It's got, as you see here, 15 voyages listed. And of course, as we've already mentioned, there are in fact over 36,000 available, 36,100 available. You can actually open any one of these voyages to get full information. Let me just move into the site itself. This is the home page of the site. If you click on the database, you will get what you've just seen in my PowerPoint. Double clicking on any of these voyages like this will bring up the full details of the voyage. So whereas you can just see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 variables here, you can get the full information by clicking on any particular voyage. And you can also search if you want to focus on North America. You can simply use these search options at the top of the table. You can select itinerary, just where the voyage goes, and you can select principal place of landing, mainland North America. Once you apply that, it immediately sorts to the 1,760 voyages which arrive into what became the United States. Once you've selected the data, then you can choose any of these tabs up here to display it in different ways. And one of the most interesting ways is this one, the time lapse. You can access this actually from the home page of the site. The time lapse will actually show you the passage of voyages across the Atlantic. Let's move to a section where there are a few more happening. And you can actually pause and select on any one of these, because each dot on the map is in fact a voyage. And if you double click on it, you can get the details of the voyage straight away. And as you can see, the selection we've made is for mainland North America. And so everything that's shown on the map is confined to arrivals in that continent. If you want to see the complete set, then you can simply reset all and the color codes in the dots moving across the map reflect the country to which the vessel belongs. This graph at the bottom will tell you the cumulative totals. And as you can see, the great majority of vessels did not go to mainland North America, but in fact to the Caribbean, but most important, to Brazil. That's something that people, a lot of people do not realize. So the numbers actually going to North America make up a very small part of the total traffic. Now, this, as I've said, is the transatlantic, but we can also move to the intra-American, because about 15% of all captives brought to the US actually began their voyage in the Caribbean rather than Africa. And we have a separate database for that, which has exactly the same features. You can find out where the vessel started, where it collected captives, and where it disembarked. And you can also show the time lapse for this, as well as these other features like the timeline, which shows you the volume of the traffic over time, and several other options that you can do with the data, including summary statistics, which gives you a quick summary of what you've just selected. By the end of this year, as I say, there'll be a lot of additional information, especially for the US, and it's certainly worth keeping your eye open for that. Now, we've also added additional features such as videos, and I'd like to show you one of these. Some of you may have seen this already, but one of the 36,000 voyages that we've got for the transatlantic traffic, we located in an archive. The records are located in an archive, but more interestingly and unusually, we found a set of plans for that vessel. And we managed to recreate those plans and create a 3D rendition of the vessel. So I'm just going to show you this.
Between 1500 and
Can you hear
1867,
the commentary?
more than 40,000 voyages set sail from Africa to the Americas, crammed with 12.5 million unwilling migrants who had been sold into slavery in exchange for European trade goods. A set of complete plans has survived for just one of these ships. The ship was the Aurore, which left La Rochelle in France on August 28, 1784, bound for the African coast. The captives it obtained there were taken to Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, in the Caribbean, and sold to the owners of sugar and coffee plantations. We close in just before the ship arrives on the African coast to get a clear view of the conditions that approximately 600 captives had to endure on their 2-month middle passage to the Caribbean. The Aurore was a typical 18th century slave ship. The main deck shows two key features designed to control the male slaves. First, the barricado, a 9-foot high wooden wall that divided the ship in two. This was topped with spikes and swivel guns. Second, 2 iron chains can be seen running along the upper deck. Every morning, the crew brought the shackled male captives up onto the deck from the spaces they had slept in overnight. The crew locked the main shackles into the chain to restrict movement. African men were not only chained in place, but continually within the firing line of the swivel guns. African women and children were imprisoned behind the barricado, normally unshackled, where they could neither see the men nor speak to them. Fearful that the male captives might escape their chains and try to capture the ship, the majority of the crew also remained behind the barricado. We descend from the quarterdeck to the officers' quarters and galley. A cook prepared the slaves' food in this boiler. The captives' diet consisted mainly of a starch such as rice, beans, or flour. Enslaved people were forced to eat this monotonous diet twice a day. They drank just 2 pints of water daily, leading to constant and often deadly dehydration. As the sun began to set, the crew, armed with whips and guns, forced the slaves below deck. The space below was divided by wooden walls to keep the men and women separated. The men were released from the deck chains and forced below, still shackled in pairs. Once below deck, crewmen packed the enslaved men together. Some were forced to lie on top of the platforms, around the side of the room. Others lay under the platforms. Each captive, on or under a platform, slept in a space just 14 to 18 inches wide and 30 inches high. Most were forced onto their sides and pressed against their neighbors. Others sat in their meager, intervening spaces. The Aurore's prisoners spent at least 14 hours in such cramped, dirty, and stifling conditions which they endured daily for 2 or 3 months before reaching the Caribbean. We have no contemporary depictions of the Aurore's 600 captives as the vessel left Malimba to cross the Atlantic Ocean. We do, however, have an image of a crammed lower slave deck painted on a voyage of a smaller slaver, the Marie Séraphique, from just a few years earlier. This comes into view in an overlay as the camera zooms out. The overlay shows only 340 captives, while the Aurore carried almost twice this number.
And if I could just add a footnote to this, we're actually developing an interactive version of this, and also the Marie Séraphique, which was mentioned briefly. And that too will be available later this year. By interactive, I mean a viewer will be able to pause at different points and receive more information. The current video is about 4.5 minutes, but the interactive version will be much longer than that. Well, probably 3 times as long, and obviously would be very useful in an educational setting. So to go back to the PowerPoint, this is just a formulation, an image of the time lapse. It shows you the great range of flags, but if you look at the lower left-hand side, you can see you've got 3 options where my cursor is, allowing you to change the settings from the flag of the ship to the location in Africa. So you can derive a color-coded distribution of captives by African region. Or, and a third option, you can color-code it by points of arrival in the Americas. You can also, as I showed you, select a single vessel and get details from it. And you can do exactly the same with any region that you care to select, in this case, mainland North America. You can also break it down by regions within mainland North America. So it's possible to actually get quite a lot of fine detail out of this. Now, we've actually developed a separate set of maps for Africa because everyone's interested in origins. But of course, the nations of Africa that exist today did not exist at the time of the slave trade. So what we've done with our data is actually to distribute it across the nations that exist today. Historians don't like doing this, but for the general public, I think this is extremely useful. You can see how important, this is for North America only, remember, how important Angola was, and also the Upper Guinea coast, which is this area, including the countries of Gambia and Sierra Leone. The Gold Coast is slightly less important, but still important. That's where the forts are, and that's where I think a lot of the general public assume that captives from Africa originated, but it's actually not quite the case. We can also present this information in terms of percentages. And you can see that the Angola and Congo region account for almost 1/4 of all the captives carried off from Africa to North America. And in summary form, you can actually select for the total to Georgia and the Carolinas, as here, and to the Chesapeake, as here, and Florida and the Gulf Coast, as here. So we're talking about roots, obviously, which is the title of the talk. And if you use the PowerPoint presentation, which I've made available to everybody, or better still, go to the website itself and create your own queries, you can actually get quite a lot out of this. Well, I hope you can anyway. We've spent a long time putting it together. And finally, here's one for the northern states from Africa. And as you might imagine, Rhode Island and New York are the main recipients here. So returning to the data themselves, this is the Intra-American database. And a big chunk of this actually relates to what is today the US. And you could also do the same time-lapse exercise using the Intra-American traffic. I don't think we've got time to do this, but I would urge you to move through to the second half of the presentation, which tries to answer the question of what the database has revealed that we did not know before. And I've summarized five major contributions, I think, which simply were not known back in 1970 when we started this project. So the basic message I want you to take away from this is do it yourself. Spend a little time familiarizing yourself with the query creation, and having done that, experiment with what you could do with the data you've selected. You've got a lot of options, from just summarizing it to actually watching it play out in the form of a time lapse. And as we've got 99 variables available, you can choose a lot of questions. What I've focused on, because of the nature of the talk today, is the geographic variables, the roots, in other words. And with that, I guess I should allow some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Eltis. We will now move to our Q&A portion of the program. So please feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A function in the Zoom to submit your questions. Thanks. Let's see. I can start off with one question while we've got people typing in. Dr. Eltis, I understand that the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers project is focused on voyages and arrivals directly from Africa to the US, but that is only one aspect of US involvement with the Middle Passage. Looking through Voyage's database, in particular during the 19th century up to the 1860s, a significant number of US companies transported captive people from Africa to other locations, for example, to Cuba. Did conditions change on ships in terms of numbers, or treatment of captives in the 19th century?
Yes, we actually have an article on that just published just over a year ago about how conditions did change. But first of all, let me make one corrective. The US was obviously heavily involved, but it was mostly in the 19th century, that is, after 1807. And it's true that the captives were taken to Brazil and Cuba in particular, rather than the US at that point. But I think the most of the owners of slave ship ventures in those years were actually Cubans and Portuguese and Brazilians. What the U.S. did was lend their flag, and they built the slave ships and sold the slave ships. But we do have cases where American ownership is clearly established, but for the most part, I think ownership was in the hands of Cubans and Brazilians. As far as conditions are concerned, the effect of attempting to suppress the slave trade was to worsen the condition under which captives traveled. And the mortality on board actually increased in the 1830s and 1840s, ironically, because of the attempts to suppress. Because slave owners or slave ship owners adopted various practices which were very unfortunate for those unwilling people carried off. At the end of the period, let's say from the 1840s, we actually have steamships showing up. If you search for steamships, I think you'll see 27 cases, all of them between 1840 and 1867, which we think was the last year in which a transatlantic slave ship voyage was carried out. And although there was clearly more space on those steamships and the time of the voyage was cut significantly, you have to keep in mind that the average number carried on a steam slave ship was over 1,000. So we have massive numbers in this last 25, 30 years of the traffic.
Okay, thank you. We've got some questions coming in. One question, is the video we just watched available in the Slave Voyages website?
Yes, it's on the home page. It's very easy, along with the time-lapse feature, actually. So let's just... Yeah, here's the home page, and there's the slave ship 3D video, and got timelines of estimates here, and then the time-lapse feature here. And if you want more information, you just scroll down on the home page. But the direct answer to your question is really at the top here. Yes.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the number of 38 million. How do we know for certain it's now 38 million?
No, 1,000. Okay. I think that's the case.
Okay.
Right, it's actually 30. First of all, we've got data on 36,100 voyages, but we spent some time probing the data and developing estimates. And those estimates suggest that, in fact, we're missing about 15% of the traffic in our database. We think that we've got 12.5 million people carried off from Africa and 10.7 million actually arriving the difference between the two, of course, is mortality in the passage. How do we know? How can we do that? Well, we've got an essay on how we built the estimates, but I'll just give you one example. One source we have is from the major port in France, Nantes, which in the 18th century required its captains of the slave ships, when they returned, to list the other ships that they had passed or met with during the voyage. What we did was make a list of all those vessels, and then we went to search for them in the database. And what we found was that we could was actually the details of 95% of voyages elsewhere, leaving from other ports. So a vessel would leave Nantes, go out, and the captain would record mostly slave ships, which he had come across. And we looked at those notes and searched for them in the database. And if we found, as I suggest, 95%, then we can assume that we're missing just 5% of the voyages. Now, the records are not as good for other ports, but there are various ways of getting around that. And if you really want more information on it, then you should go to the estimates part of the database, or better still, if you go to the downloads, you can actually find the essays on which we built our estimates.
Okay. I have a question from an Eltia Blunt. Is it best to do some sort of DNA test to understand a bit more about family origin lineage before using the database? For example, my maternal lineage is from the Americas, South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
However, my paternal lineage is from the Caribbean, St. Vincent. How would you approach starting a search?
Well, you need to select essentially voyages coming into St. Vincent, and just look at the profile of where people were coming from. That obviously does not help to identify individuals. This is tough to do because clearly a person's identity was wiped out by the slave trade. We have African names for only 95,000 of the what we think were 12.5 million. So it's hard to pick out information or create information on an individual, but at least what you can get is the likely African provenance of people coming into St. Vincent. And if you have a year, you can narrow it down further.
Okay. A couple more questions. We've got a few questions here. Let's go with the question, what else did we learn that we didn't know before in your research?
I don't know where to begin on that. I mentioned it.
Big open-ended question. Feel free.
Well, probably the best thing is to actually rip through the last part of the presentation. Okay, so one thing is that we found that more slaves arrived in Spanish America than the whole of the British Caribbean combined. Spanish America tends to get ignored, but in fact, it was a major disembarkation region for African captives. So that was certainly something I had no clue about before starting out.
Okay, one more question.
Just a second, I was just.
Oh, are you going to open something up? Okay.
Yeah. Right. So, um, a second point was how widely distributed involvement in the slave trade was. Like we've got over 200 ports in the Atlantic dispatching vessels to Africa, which again was something I never imagined possible. Thirdly, most or as many slave voyages were organized in the Americas as in Europe. The triangular trade really doesn't reflect the reality because there was a massive trade which was bilateral from the Caribbean and from Brazil to Africa and back again. No triangle was involved. Uh, we know far more about the Middle Passage now, duration, etc. And we are finding out more about the people who organized the traffic as well as the captives who were caught up in it. And we can create tables like this, the top 10 British slave traders from past. Past stands for people of the Atlantic slave trade. Anyway, time for other questions. So this is just a quick summary.
We do have more coming your way. The database shows 36,000 voyages. Historically, does this number represent the total number of voyages up to 1860? Also, does the database show the total number of ships that were involved in the trade?
Ships as opposed to voyages, I guess is meant. You could do it that way. But anyway, answer to the first part is yes, it goes down to 1866. There's a possible voyage in 67, but we're not sure about it. But if we've got 36,000 voyages, we've probably got something like, I would say, 12,000 or 15,000 ships making those voyages. I think that was the intent of the question.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Mick Hua. How did you get into this field of study?
Right. Maybe I'll put my wife on here.
Speak your truth, Dr. Eltis.
It comes out of civil rights in the 1960s. I think, did an MA thesis on abolition in 1969. And then I got interested in the numbers. Like I mentioned, Philip Curtin's book in the 1950s, the estimates of the slave trade ranged from something like 5 million to 60 million. And you still see figures which are out of line with what we are suggesting. But none of those data had very strong foundations. And myself and of course others, large number of others in the field, decided to try and track down just exactly what the scale of it was. So I guess that was the starting point. And then all the other details, of course, emerged as a byproduct of that. So that's the short answer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. A question came in from Jean Tinney. Has the data showing countries of origin in Africa to the U.S. been adjusted to include the shipments from the Caribbean to the U.S.?
Good question. They're separate at the moment, but we have actually it's an article in 2008 which puts them together. So we've got, as I say, about 15% of the traffic into the US coming from the Caribbean, 85% coming from Africa. And the grand total is closing in on 400,000, which compared to the 5 million going to Brazil, as you can see, fairly small. I mean, the very large African-American population in the US in 1870 there was a census conducted in the US in which people had to identify their origins, where they were born, and of the 4 million former slaves in 1870, all but about 40,000 claimed to have been born in the US. So the major source of the large Black American population was actually natural increase rather than slave trade.
Thank you. There's a question coming in about resources. What do you have? Do you have any resources for educators looking to incorporate these resources into their lessons?
Yes, we do have. We have lesson plans. Um, the site has many features which I haven't shown you, but you can certainly access lesson plans. And we actually have a specialist on the team who works with educators. So we're very conscious of the need to make our data available to schools. I think we've had children from grade 5 on actually using the data. So we could do more, and we will. What we need is a few more resources in terms of funding.
Okay, and all of that information's on the website.
Yeah, it's on the website. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Another question for you. Is there any data on the indigenous of North America being transported to the West Indies or Cuba or Europe?
Well, there certainly should be, but the short answer is there isn't.
Is that something you're working on?
Well, actually, excuse me.
Or is this the information not available?
Yeah, the sources are nowhere near as good. But what we're doing is sort of expanding in a different direction. There's very significant traffic out of Africa to the east. And what I mean is the Indian Ocean. And we're creating a proposal for funding to add an interface, a user interface to the site, which would take that into account. Africans went to India, and you can find blacks in China. So there's significant traffic going on. It's not on the same scale as the transatlantic traffic, but it's certainly not trivial. And that's really what we're focusing on rather than the indigenous population of the Americas.
Okay, thank you. Questions are still coming in. This is good. Another question. Are you aware, this came from Holly Fulton, are you aware of any efforts to recreate exactly what a slave ship was to be shown in a museum? Or is there already one on display somewhere?
We're actually in the middle of a joint project with the museum in Nantes in France. Actually that museum was the source of the plans that I showed you for the Aurore video. But we're working with them on a different ship called the Mary Seraphique, for which, incredibly enough, the owner commissioned paintings. He was retiring from the trade, and he wanted a memoir. So he commissioned two of his officers, who happened to be painters, to depict the conditions on the slave deck during the voyage. In fact, there are three paintings, one of the ship before it reaches Africa, one of the transatlantic voyage itself, and one of the sale of the captives in Saint-Domingue, which is, of course, now Haiti. And the museum holds these paintings, and we're in the process of converting this amazing resource into another 3D video, which will run alongside the Aurora, and and I think certainly will replace it. The Aurora video has had something like 70,000 viewings since we put it up last year, which is certainly the most popular thing I've ever been associated with.
All right, we have a few more questions. From Elena Keikos. This is astounding work. Thank you. She wanted to give you a shout out. This is great. But her question is, can you speak to which organizations are currently using your work?
Well, we can start with the museum in Washington. If you go to the basement, you'll see a lot of the illustrations derived directly from our site. And in fact, we're hoping to, well, at the start of the presentation, someone said that the site was based at Emory. I think it was you, actually. But what we're trying to do is move the site into a multi-institutional environment. There's a huge problem in the digital humanities with sustainability. And I think the only way we can actually support a project like this in perpetuity is to move it to joint ownership. And with that in mind, there's a good chance that this site will actually move to Rice University. But we're also in the process of recruiting 4 other institutions. And I hope there's going to be an announcement in the next 2 weeks finalizing this. So Emory will be one of them, but it'll no longer be simply Emory alone.
Okay, thank you. Aaron Fogelman asked, are the Transatlantic and Intra-American databases relational? And by the way, there's a comment also.
Yes.
He said the slave ship video is excellent, and can you add images of the actual crossing?
Well, okay, the first answer to the first question is yes, they're both relational. You can switch from one to the other, and in fact, you can switch to the people involved. We've got an interface of the 95,000 Africans for whom we have names from the 19th century, African names, I mean, and this database is obviously connected to the Transatlantic slave trade database, and we're developing a database of owners and captains and buyers and sellers of slaves. And this project supported by the Mellon Foundation, and that too will be added. So you'll be able to swing from one to the other with great ease. What was the second part of the question?
The other one was some feedback. First of all, the slave ship video was excellent.
Yeah.
The question was, could you add images of the actual crossing? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, we have to stop short of a film, obviously, but it will be possible to reproduce the image that I mentioned before that was painted by one of the officers below decks. It's amazingly detailed, and we hope to have that ready before the end of the year.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. This comes from Trudy Bradford Taliaferro. Can you be specific about how many slaves from specific areas, say slaves from Mali, for example, were transported in specific years and to specific places in North America, say Maryland, for example?
Yes. The user interface allows you to have will give you the detail on individual ports, both of departure and of arrival. And of course, if you can do it by year as well. So we have 99 variables currently in the database. About a third of those are geographic. So there's fine level of detail possible. You can do it by region, you can do it by country, you can do it by port. So yes, all that's possible.
Okay, thank you. And considering the traffic in the Indian Ocean, what will that become an entire section of the database? And will it include voyages to the Mascarenes?
Yeah, yes, for sure. Yeah, that's the Mascarene.
Mascarene.
The Mascarene Islands are very well documented, so there's no problem with that. We're in the process of preparing an application. I mean, all of this requires funding, obviously, and the Indian Ocean project, we haven't even submitted that. It's going to be probably later this year. As far as results are concerned, I think that's 2 or 3 years away because there's a lot of work involved.
Okay, really quickly, I'll squeeze in one more question from Robert Cataliotti. How much and what kind of information have you been able to acquire from ship's logs and or diaries of the crews?
Ship's logs are kind of dull. One finds a log and one gets very excited. But in fact, 95% of the information is about geocodes, about where the vessel is. Occasionally you get some great information, but there's a lot of diaries kept by crew behind the data that you can see. I remember just quickly, there's one of the variables is source. I didn't show it to you, but it's easy enough to bring up. Every voyage has all the sources for that voyage listed. And you just click the detail page, double click on a particular voyage and scroll down to the sources. And we've got over 1,000 of these.
All right, Dr. Eltis, thank you so much for your time and knowledge today. This has been a wonderful conversation. We still have questions in the queue, so we may not be able to get to all of them. We obviously didn't get to all of them. Well, however, if we did not answer your question, please feel free to email your question to middlepassagemarkers@gmail.com, and your questions will be answered there. Also, for more information on the voyages database developed by Dr. Eltis, please go to his website.
It's not just Dr. Eltis. There's hundreds of people involved in this.
Okay. Please go to slavevoyages.org. Thank you to the board and to those who donated and volunteered for making this 2021 Black History Month speaker series possible. Special thanks to Nick Huster for his expertise in putting this program together so that we can all experience this event. We do hope that everyone comes back next Monday, February 8th at 2 p.m. for our next event in this series. The topic is From the Middle Passage to the Plantation, the Journey and History in Song. Our special guest speaker for this will be Dr. Jason Obi, Professor of Music at Texas Southern University. Thank you all for joining today and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.